Queens. Welcome to this week's episode of Being Human. I'm back for the second time with Kayvan Kian. For those who caught the last episode, we discussed his first book, What is Water? And now we're here to look at his second, What is Wisdom? Kayvan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. Great to see you again.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see you. And I was just saying, as I came on the call, your tone was just immediately calming. This all this reading of philosophy must be doing wonders for your soul.
Might be the effect you have on your interviewees in this case. Yeah.
Maybe. And I was also saying, versus the first book, there's some new faces, some new philosophers that you're including. I really enjoyed the book. And again, a short book, super easy read. So for anybody who's daunted by the idea of diving into ancient philosophy, this could not be more accessible. So it's great. Maybe we should start with what. Well, first of all, let's hear a little bit of background. For those who are not familiar with you and your role in the world, and then maybe we talk a bit about the motivation for the second book.
Yeah, definitely. Always good to give also some updates since the last time we spoke. But I think last time I shared how I like to create things. So I've had my own companies that I set up. I've worked for many years as a consultant in business for McKinsey. I, in addition to that, like to think and write. And over the course of the years, built a program called the Young Leaders Forum, where we bring together many young leaders. I would say young at heart. There's no age limit in this sense. And helping each other think through, how do you stay sane in a crazy changing world? How do you lead, grow, and thrive? And how do you make better decisions? And that was also a motivation for these books, to say, I learned a lot from all these conversations and lessons and putting them into practice. How can we make much of this content accessible for everyone else who might also be interested, but doesn't have the time or the attention to go through maybe all those thick, old philosophical books, but wants to get to the point and how to apply everything. Yes.
Yeah. And then so this is about decision making. And is there anything, particularly about this latest volume that you were, intent on achieving with the book?
Now, similar to What is Water, these are challenges, issues, things I would come across for myself personally, and quite quickly realized that there are many others who are also going through all of this. And especially, I think many can remember the months March, April 2020, when so much became unclear that even the people before would think, I've got it, I know how to handle things. All of a sudden I had to make many important decisions. Are you going to still invest in this business idea or not? Are you going to pursue this acquisition or merger? Are you going to join this other company? Are you going to move to a new geography? And I also noticed for myself, what are you going to base all these decisions on when the crystal ball is not so crystal clear anymore? And this book, I hope, helps people answer this question for themselves. What's a wise thing to do right now? What is wisdom? And not by saying, follow the ideas of this philosopher and you'll always get to the right destination, but trusting very much the judgment of the reader to say, these are different ways to think about this situation. This is like your personal advisory board of Aristotle, Nietzsche, and so many other thinkers. And the main skill to practice is how well can you switch between these very different ways of thinking. And hopefully, at least whatever decision you make, you won't regret it. You can always say, well, I gave it the thought it was asking, and here we are.
Yeah, no, I love that framing, and how many of us stop and think. It sort of makes me laugh to say it, but what would be the wise decision right now?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I often find myself reflecting, like, what would be, you know, the best thing to do, or, you know, what should I do?
Mm-hmm.
But qualifying it with wise gives it a whole different tenor, right? And then
yeah. I would say for the sense that you could always, you know, say, you know, what's the right thing to do, but all of a sudden, at least many have the feeling that whatever decision they make or don't make just has a lot of implications. It could have implications on other people's health, things that maybe before 2020, not many people were thinking a lot about. And small steps, big steps. So there is, of course, a risk that people can get almost paralyzed with all this, you know, paralysis by analysis, or trying to quantify things with the same tools that helped in the past. And in this case, yeah, maybe elevating these questions and saying, yeah, what would be a wise decision, helps you to think things through a little bit better.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then maybe that is part of the motivation of the book, is to have people ask that question specifically,
yes.
like more often, what would be a wise thing to do? And then, of course, it begs the decision, well, how would I make a wise decision? Like, how would I know if it was wise? What tools might I use in order to make a wise decision? It sort of opens up a new vista, right?
Yeah, and it becomes a bit impersonal in the sense that, you know, I believe this should be done. Versus, taking all these different perspectives into account. At least for now, this could be the best next step. And it is very humbling to realize that the world is in many ways way more complex than we either maybe know or prefer. And this way, we hopefully also can have a common and shared language around it. So one could say, well, I get your point of you want to move ahead, for instance, with this merger or this business idea. But you could think about, okay, but what would Hippocrates say in this case? What could be the unintended consequences? And without, you know, becoming very personal, you can always objectively say, hey, yeah, that's a good point. Let's think that through. And who knows what comes out of that conversation.
Yeah. I'm just smiling at the thought of saying in a business meeting, what would Hippocrates think in this scenario? It's a way to either completely alienate every colleague, or come over as like the wisest guy in the room. It's a fine line, isn't it?
Oh yeah, maybe at least it will spark some curiosity when people feel stuck. Yeah.
Right. But I also like that, and I can see why with your young forum, you know, your young leaders forum, is that, I guess, by explicitly creating a space where you're saying, no, we're going to look at this question of wisdom, and we're going to invite these philosophical voices into our conversation. You've kind of created the space where people could ask the question, what would Hippocrates say or do or think in this way? Yeah. No, I can see that.
Yeah. And at the very minimum, asking themselves. It's not about convincing others you should think like him or her, but when you're faced with a certain decision, realizing, at least from this angle, that good intentions don't automatically lead to good results, especially in a complex environment. So not being blinded by your sense of, let's say, purity and intentions and goodness, but very, you know, technically thinking through what could go wrong, how could this turn out differently, and being a bit more cautious can give you actually a more sense of confidence that what you're doing is at least thought through.
Yeah. What could consider the consequences, which is what, when in your chapter on Hippocrates, you bring that out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Very
should we
much
expand a bit on that then? Like how to think like Hippocrates? I mean, I know we've got a bunch to potentially touch on, but
I think it's something that personally helped me a lot. And it is, as I said, in the end, many leaders young leaders, old leaders, how you want to say it. Most people I meet, at least maybe if not all, want to make a positive difference. They want to create something that is helpful for others and the like. I haven't met somebody who wants to make life more difficult for others, so to speak. But the question here becomes, Hippocrates would say, from the medical perspective, first, do no harm. And realizing that with good intentions, you might actually cause unintended harm. Now, whether it's intended or unintended, the bottom line is that you made a difficult situation worse. And you don't want to regret the actions that you took, of course, looking back. And this is a very more ethical ways to think through. Or when you decide to go pursue something, you can make sure you can adapt on the way. Don't make these big, irreversible, large-scale decisions that who knew what could come out of it. And Mother Nature or humanity or whatever problem you're trying to solve for them don't care about your intentions, of course, down the line. Did you do something good or not? And Hippocrates helps you. It hits the brakes, but in a mindful way, so that you become indeed maybe a little bit wiser when it comes to the decisions that you make.
Yeah, and it's hitting the brakes. What could happen? What could all the consequences of this decision be?
Mm-hmm.
A step by step, methodically thinking through in that way, which. Yeah, it doesn't come naturally, doesn't it? I'm thinking about, Kahneman, thinking fast and thinking slow. It doesn't come easily to us, does it, as humans to slow down in that way?
You're right. It doesn't come easily because the real harm is often not in the first consequence. That you can predict to a certain extent. And the real harm is possibly hidden further down the chain. And that takes, of course, a lot of imagination or thinking or indeed life experience and the like. And just knowing or acknowledging that you don't know might, again, be a bit more humbling, so that you make sure that if something does go differently than expected, you can course correct, or at least you can make sure that you can make better decisions on the way. But doesn't come naturally, mainly because of these elements are further down the chain. Yeah,
that's right. And perhaps that's why one of the reasons we revere these philosophers is because they've gone against the grain, right? They've trained themselves over years to slow down their thinking process. And that has resulted in them making better decisions, but also perhaps at some level we revere them because of that skill alone, just to slow down and think deeply.
Think deeply. And of course, these ideas, I guess, existed before these philosophers. But at least in this book, these names symbolize the idea. Yeah. So that it does make it easier in the heat of the moment to think, indeed, what would Hippocrates say in this moment, where you can actually visualize somebody sitting in the room, raising his hand and saying, hey, how about any unintended harm, versus memorizing a lot of concepts and that they're abstract and thinking about hidden harm further down the chain, etc. That might be less easy. So the book is also structured around these names. But of course, these ideas existed before these people. However, they were maybe very helpful in popularizing and thinking these things through much better than others.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And it brings to mind a quote from Bernard Shaw, right? That he says, like, most men think 2 or 3 times a year. I've built an international reputation based on thinking 2 or 3 times a week. Right. Like, and that rang true for me, right? Like, how often do I consciously mark out time? Of course, I'm thinking all the time, but I think what he means is that how do you deliberately stop and make space think through something, to think in a deliberative manner.
That's it. Yeah. And hopefully with this book, you feel you have all these coaches, all these members of your advisory board who, help you, guide you a bit along the way, so you don't have to start from scratch. With the intent, again, not of saying, this is the way you should always think, but to practice the ability to switch. In the book, there's a chapter on Thales, who thinks in patterns. And of course, if you cannot think in any kind of pattern, it's very easy to know that you're going to repeat a lot of past mistakes. Because, many things that happen today, you can say they're analogies for the past. At the same time, if you only think in patterns, you're going to run into a lot of other problems, because maybe it's a false pattern. Maybe you're just connecting dots that, are not really needed to connect. They have nothing to do with each other. But in your imagination, they might have. And that's where Democritus comes and says, forget about patterns. Don't forget about using your senses. What's happening in front of you? What do you really see? Not what should you see in a moment like this, but what you actually see, hear, smell, feel. And that's ability to switch, when to switch, like gears in a car. That is, of course, the real skill that is very hard, but very worthwhile to pursue and practice.
Yeah, like meta wisdom.
Meta wisdom, because indeed, if somebody would tell you what's the best gear to drive in, you wouldn't even know how to answer that question, right? You say, well, I often drive in the third or the fourth, but obviously you need to be able to switch through depending on the situation, when a surprise comes your way or anything. It's not a values judgment. It's a very practical way of using your vehicle.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I'm also thinking Democritus, and that I've not heard of him before, right? That was the first time I'd heard that name. And could we say the original mindfulness guru?
Well, he simplified a lot of things, and of course we now know better. But he was one of the first to say the world exists of atoms and empty space, and the rest is, stories or whatever we make out of it. But there are actual real building blocks, and we should make sure we're still in touch with that and don't get too much lost in our minds. And if there's lightning happening, or if there's some other natural disaster happening, there might actually be real causes that we can observe, measure, very much the empirical scientific method in all of that. And the same would apply in a business situation, where you can say, there's a certain policy, HR policy that we want to implement, and this and that. And you can say, hey, this has worked well in other organizations, and this is how it turned out. You can think in patterns, but do you measure the real thing, right? Is this really helpful or not? How are people responding to it? Is the situation exactly what you had predicted it to be? Because otherwise you get completely out of touch. And that's where the switching comes, of course, into play. And again, if that is the only way you think, you're going to miss out on being able to predict things, manage risks in the right way, because you miss out on the patterns. You might miss out on what you want to do, which is a very different angle to look at. Nietzsche would highly encourage you to think in that way, and so forth and so forth.
Well, yeah, so talk about Nietzsche a little bit then, just expand on the point you just made.
So in the ways of thinking of different philosophers, there's this idea around, for instance, focusing on what you can control. We talked a lot about that. And where do you have, where can you make a difference and what not? And in challenging crises, you can imagine that's a very helpful way of thinking. But if that, again, is the only way that you think, then you might miss out on what you actually want in life. Not only what can I do, but what do I want to do? And the idea of eternal recurrence, an old one that Nietzsche also further popularized, is the thought experiment that whatever is happening today, whatever you're doing right now, including having this podcast, Richard, for you, or somebody who's listening to this, this would recur an infinite amount of times until forever, because the universe keeps repeating somehow, some way. And not to use that as a worldview, but the immediate question, of course, is how would that feel, that thought? Would you regret having spent this day in January this way, or not? And that helps you to stay a bit on track with not what can I do, but what do I want to do? And the weight of eternity helps you to wake up a bit with all the specific actions, independent maybe even of certain consequences. So in the book, referencing the idea of somebody's thinking whether I should, launch a company or not. And all these different people might give good advice. What's the market? How can this develop? Is this wise from a financial point of view? But maybe through this lens, the question would be, okay, who cares? Does it matter if this is a financial success or not? If this opportunity would come back in the future, would you regret not having taken it? Right? If you've always wanted to create and build, maybe that's the real goal in this case. So don't forget about also your own personal wishes while you're making decisions these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's a very powerful thought experiment, which is you describe it in the book, isn't it? So if this were Groundhog Day and I was in this day for eternity, is this the day I'd choose?
That's it. Yeah. And the fact that you didn't leave this meeting, hopefully that's a good sign.
Yeah, but that's a good. But well, I mean, yeah, of course, at one level it is. But then it's it's such a. I mean, it reminds me of the Steve Jobs quote, right? Isn't it? And I think he says it for 3 days, right? He says if for 3 days on the trot you're thinking you don't want to do, have the life that you're in, and that's an indicator you need to change. That's
an indicator. And as long as you're aware of that, who knows, maybe somebody says, well, yes, but the real reason I'm doing this is because I maybe, care less about, just doing in life what you want. And life is not about that necessarily. And I'm here for other things. And that's a part of Aristotle coming in about building your character, actually going maybe against what you want in order to build virtues that are of importance to you. And it's a different angle, of course, to look at. But I hope that the reader, by looking at it purely from one lens, feels that it also helps to clarify, because these thoughts can, of course, get very messy if all of a sudden 12 different people are talking at the same time from a different angle. So that in this case, you just go one by one, collecting your thoughts. And at the end, then you can say, well, I've heard all of you. Thank you for your wise advice. And, given taking everything into consideration, I'm going to still decide to start this company. But I know, the why and how and everything that can happen as of today. Yeah. So like a kind of parliament of elders in your mind that you, that you consult. I mean, I've heard that before, right? As a practice, right? Is to just, if you don't have a group of wise people around you, mentors, create them in your head and then channel the thoughts of each of those individuals. And it can be as powerful, but it can be powerful. I don't think I've ever really consciously attempted that technique. But I guess you're offering a version of that here, right? Is you use this book as a reference and you familiarize yourself with the way of thinking and then apply it. And then presumably over time, that just becomes more habitual. Indeed. Just like the gears, again, in a vehicle. Maybe at first you're thinking, oh, how do I go from 2 to 4? And how does this work? And did I, use the right move at the right time. And this just costs a lot of energy for everyone who can still remember that. Either it's on a bike or in a car or anywhere else. But to your point, it could become habitual, more instinctive to say, hey, this is interesting. Everybody's moving this way. Maybe it is a good moment to think, what's would Socrates say in this case? And the mantra of, is that really so? Right? And almost to the level of being very annoying, challenging, right? If any assumption, any fact, anything that somebody brings to the table, because that might be the voice that is missing at that particular moment of time. And again, not to halt any form of decision making, but to make sure that the final decision is definitely a better one than it otherwise would have been.
Yeah. And allowing yourself to be your own skeptic. Yeah.
Some of us have maybe too many skeptics around us. So maybe you have the luxury of having many Socrates in your life. But then it would be helpful to maybe go for another chat, right? And to add that person to your life. Yeah.
You refer to it as skeptical capital, right? Like in your life, like do a skeptic inventory. And I think that's right. And of course and then you got to try to draw the line there between cynics and skeptics, right? You don't want too many just cynics in your life. But yeah, having some skeptics.
Each angle taken to the extreme, as you can imagine, can cause a lot of problems in practice because the world is very complex. You cannot just have this mono lens taken too far, doubting every single thing that exists, doubting whether there's something as knowledge, whether and so forth. All these existential questions, you can imagine, won't get you very far if you're running your own business and you have to think, should I sign this contract or not? So it is also helpful to know that maybe we've taken this way of thinking too far. It's important to know what you want, but of course there are limits in only pursuing that path for yourself and others. Right? There's an idea around Hipparchia in the book on values. So what are my values? Which trade-offs am I willing to make? Which price am I willing to pay for what? In which case? And at least then that that path, whatever it will turn out to become, was a meaningful one. And you were being able to make the decisions. You couldn't quantify the right decision. Right? Should you hire this person or not? Or should you do this initiative or not? But at least that it was according to the values that you had. How do you want to treat others? How do you want to spend these crises years? How do you want to look back on this, and the like? But again, another angle to pursue. Yeah.
What's the wise decision to make here, given my values?
Yeah. How well do you know your values? How well do you know the right trade-off? And of course, most people would say, creativity is important, freedom is important, wonder is important, and the like. But when it comes down to it, are you willing to pay a price for creativity in your career, in your personal life, and going forward? Because if not, then you might think maybe it's not a real value, right?
Yeah. No, I can see that. I'm wondering, because the more I consider this, the more I'm viewing it as a discipline.
Mm-hmm.
What in your work with young leaders and even with yourself, I suppose, what do you think makes the difference between someone who develops disciplines around thinking, let's say, and those who just don't develop it?
The main difference would be a practical one. I can't step into the shoes of somebody and say, maybe one is happier or not, or this and that, because switching between different ways of thinking, it takes effort, it's hard work. And I'm not even sure whether a person would feel more satisfied in life, right? It's actually a difficult skill that you're taking up. What I can say is that people who do have that flexibility, of course, are much better able in making decisions that actually work in practice, are able to get people along and work when they have an idea, inspire them, motivate them, navigate through and it all. And it helps you match the way of thinking with maybe the situation at hand versus hoping that the situation somehow adapts to your way of thinking so that, you get lucky. So it increases the chances that you can actually get closer to where you need to be, want to be. And that is, let's say, bottom line. It helps you to adapt so much better in different situations. And it helps that you can guide others. When somebody speaks, it's easy to say, where does that come from? Or, that's a crazy way of thinking or an idea. But maybe understanding where this person actually is coming from. Say, hey, that's something Nietzsche would actually say. And I get the spirit of what is being said. Nevertheless, let me share with this person that might not be the best way, or maybe we can tweak it. So you're a much more helpful team member. You are able to make people feel heard, seen. You're able to channel all these different perspectives. It's a bit of an art, so to speak. So it's a long answer to a short question. I would say there is sometimes life might seem easier not knowing what you don't know. But in the long run, over the course of the years and decades, probably life will teach you these lessons somehow, some way. So maybe you can learn them a bit upfront. So at least it's more enjoyable and slightly less painful in the process.
Yeah. And that makes sense as the pitch to someone to develop these skills. But I'm still interested in what's the disposition of those who take this on,
mm-hmm.
And is there anything people can do to better equip themselves to develop these as disciplines?
That's a good one. I think the disposition would be a sense of humbleness. A sense of realizing that the extent to which the world outside you is complex, and or at least trying to imagine that, and realizing that simple ways of this just came up in me might not be sufficient to cope or adapt with that. So there's a sense of humbleness. There's a sense of curiosity. And there is a deep-seated drive, need to make things work. There's a certain idealism, because why would you go through all this effort in thinking these things through? Similar, you could ask, why would someone in the medical world go through all those years of studying and practice and the like? There's a deep sense of, I want to cure maybe this patient. I want to be there for that person. So there's a disposition there, and it helps a lot to talk with people about these things. That's an excellent way, maybe the best way to practice and learn. But especially these days when you're not surrounded with a lot of people in person, a lot of casual, informal conversations don't happen and the like. I hope that this book sort of is some kind of supplement for those conversations that unfortunately don't take place easily.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. The idea of surrounding yourself with people who talk about these topics. And I'm just applying it to my own experience. Like I don't really have friends in my life who we won't debate the merits of Heraclitus together, right? I mean, I hear it on podcasts. I'm talking to you now. I read books, but like making a conscious effort to build, relationships, friendships, around these interests.
Indeed. And I've worked with people who shared the book with their team members. So at least you have a bit of a shared language.
Right. And, that's a great idea, right? To hand this out or if you've got a book club at work or something, right?
Yeah.
Like, there you go. Also good for your book sales, but yeah.
And that, or you read the book and you present some thoughts and ideas out of it to your colleagues in a few minutes. But typically, it's not a lack of goodwill from others. It's just a lot of effort to go through that, and the not having not having a shared language in which you can discuss these things. And you and I, if we would need to make a decision, you could say, hey, what would Hippocrates maybe think of what we're trying to do? I immediately at least understand your intention, and I might not take it as a personal, attack of saying, hey, have you thought this through or not? But understanding that, you're right. We're so much thinking about what could go right. What do we want to go right? Why should it go right? But let's pause for a moment. Thanks, Richard, for bringing that up.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think that the humility, being humble. Well, we were talking a bit about on the show, surrender, right? Surrendering to the reality that we're in this, this complex world, and that it may take effort to come to good decisions.
Indeed.
Right. And that just my immediate impulse on a particular topic, may not be the best route.
That's it. And it could have been for a different context, or it might be in this case if you're lucky, or maybe wiser than the decade ago. But you might not have the luxury to afford, going for luck. In this case. And one thing that the past years have shown us is that, luck is not always on our side. A lot of things, unfortunately, happened for a lot of us that we, couldn't foresee, didn't want, and the like. So given this situation, even not making a decision is a decision. You cannot change the situation that you're in today. Immediately, you cannot change that context. You cannot make it less complex, etc., etc. What can you do? Well, you can look at it from different perspectives and immediately, quickly decide what would be the best thing for today.
Yeah. And but I have to say, given all of that, when I just look at the sort of political decision making, at least the sort of public face of that, that doesn't seem to be applied, right? It very much seems to have been okay, this is the current situation. This is what we control. This is what we need to do. I didn't hear sort of, publicly airing. Okay, well, if we did this, then we might expect X, Y, Z to happen. And given all of that versus the potential benefit of doing this, there didn't seem to that could we call it the sort of Hippocratic style of thinking? But ironically enough, given the health crisis, occurred. Just to take an example, it's And
you can imagine that if this is already difficult to have conversations like this with a small team or a business department, we've noticed the difficulty of having these conversations on a societal level.
Yeah.
And if you indeed don't have that common language, shared language, use the same words, but do you mean the same? Do you immediately get it when somebody raises that point? My personal wish would be that, if anything, through these years of different crises, all through together, the necessity for at least creating these shared languages, whatever they are, right? It's not about this book, but being able to think through difficult problems through different perspectives. I hope our collective ability will only improve because we know how important it is when it really comes down to it.
Yeah. It's almost like you're proposing a wisdom culture. And just think about how far our current popular culture is, at least from my eyes, from a wisdom culture. I mean,
I like to imagine. Of course, I didn't live in those days, but I like to imagine that in the, let's say, ancient times or other times when definitely we were spending much more time in our local communities. There was no access, neither physical or virtual, digital, with others. We had this sense of having elders, people who've the easy or hard way had to learn some wise lessons. And I can only imagine that if there was a crisis locally, that these elders and others would actually get together and have conversations in ways that they could at least understand each other. And no decision will be perfect. If it was a simple problem, that would have been different. And that idea, I can only hope that more and more people will be able to have together, be it in a family, be it in your community, be it at work, at the very least with yourself. In this case,
yeah. I mean, of course, it all has to start with ourselves. We have the onus. I apply this to myself right now. Like how much of my working hours are dedicated to consciously developing my wise thinking skills. It's like, probably count that in minutes per year. So it's of course it starts with the individual. And then you're right. I think communities were structured differently. We respected our elders to a greater degree. People had time and space to think through, to consult elders. I mean, you imagine that there was a greater sort of wisdom quotient in some of these older cultures.
And maybe it's imagined or not, but nevertheless, it is a wish for us collectively going forward. Given that the complexity of today, there's no hint that it's going to decrease with more and more things being more and more intertwined in so many ways globally. So at least being able to talk about that, think that through, think about different ways of thinking, understanding where the other is coming from, being able to switch. Again, this is a lot of hard work. And I'm not pretending that I can do this effortlessly. But writing this did, of course, force me in many ways to think much more than I might have otherwise done.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's it. I mean, you haven't mentioned that, but writing presumably is part of this. I mean, I journal, but I tend to do a lot more work around, like feelings and emotional work. I do less around my thinking skills. Is that a good tool here as well?
If writing is something that you get energy from, definitely, of course, it's nice. But the form in which you do it shouldn't be a barrier to actually do it. If you have good friends, if you have a book club, if you enjoy just walking, or something so small just before any important decision, and you already maybe know what you're going to do, nevertheless, still pausing and say, hey, what would indeed Socrates say? Or what would Hipparchia ask me? Or this and that, even if it's a formality, but it nevertheless helps you practice in easy times, especially for those moments where it really matters, where much more is at stake, much more than you might even realize.
Right. Yeah. So find your own way to pay attention to this.
To switch and in a playful way. So these are heavy topics, but it doesn't mean that the practice should be in a very unnecessarily heavy way. This can be enriching, could be playful, it can be fun, it could be interesting. It can be done in a curious way. And exploring these fields, you have this magnificent brain. How well can you guide your own thinking, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a great bit. That's something we sort of, it's worth pausing. I think we all have these extraordinary, magnificent brains, right?
And we don't even know how they work.
Creative potential, and we're gifted with this ability to think, and training that. There could be no better a sort of return on investment in one's life than training your thinking ability.
Could be. And who knows, you might also decide that, these ways of thinking from that we covered in the book are not for me. For whatever reason, like somebody deciding in the car, I'll never shift to the fifth gear for, a variety of reasons. I choose not to. And that's fine. But at least it's there. At least it was a conscious choice. At least 10 years down the road, you won't say, hey, why didn't anybody show me that this even existed? I could have saved myself a lot of time and energy in all of this.
Yeah. Which makes me think, how much of this are you trying to take into schools? Because, I'd not heard of a single one of these. These were never mentioned, through in my entire education, until I left university. Isn't that extraordinary? Right?
There is, for me, I think I was lucky enough to attend a high school where we also had Latin and Greek, even though the emphasis was a lot on translating texts without necessarily talking a lot about, what the content and the thinking behind it. It did expose me a little bit to these worlds. There is, of course, the question, what is that education about? I'm personally very hesitant to say, people should learn this or people should learn that. But at least when you are going through school, when you are going through college, or when you are growing up, having the freedom to explore a bit and to practice these things, especially when the decisions you're making are not of such a great, they don't carry that much weight. My first startup carried much less weight than the decisions when I made back then than the second one, or the things that I'm doing today. Nevertheless, I'm very happy I was able to practice early. And in this case, you could ask yourself, well, if school is about knowledge, it's about learning a lot of things, maybe it is helpful indeed to practice different perspectives without necessarily being too prescriptive. And the same way that the book is written.
Yeah. It's a very equivocal answer. I wanted you to say, we should be having this in every school, in every land on the globe.
Who am I to want that?
That's why it's back to your humbleness. Yeah.
I think it's, but I understand the intent, and I can imagine that it is for youth, especially growing up in days like this, growing up in a world that does seem to feel much more intertwined and complex and the like. There's much more decisions that maybe young people have to make these days, and maybe there was a time that people had the luxury of being a bit naive in all of that. I can, of course, recommend anyone to read the book or any other book that helps them to switch between different ways of thinking.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you. It feels like maybe there's a couple of characters we left out, but maybe we'll leave that for people so they can buy the book and dive into all of them. So. Yeah, really enjoyed it, and thanks. Yeah, and you sent me a personal note in the copy you gave to me. Enjoy, and to the moon of wise thinking.
Yeah, don't hope you won't have too many barriers in practicing different ways of thinking.
No. Good. Well, we'll certainly put a link to the book. There's your website, www. Kayvan Kian, which is Kayvankian. That's Kayvankian.com. Anywhere else you would point people who've taken an interest?
if they're interested, social media, any channel through LinkedIn, for instance, or others. If there are any questions, feel free to indeed reach out.
Fabulous. All right. Well, thank you once again. This has been awesome. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and all the helpful questions. A lot of food for thought also for me. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks.